that which lies beyond civilization.
The weird and the eerie.
Hello, everyone. We are Lost Futures, a Mark Fisher podcast, and I'm Steve,
Marlowe.
and we're joined today by author, uh, mythnogeographist Phil Smith, here to talk about his latest book, Albion's Eco-Eerie. And in this episode, we are going to focus on Nigel Neal, and his Quatermass series, of which he wrote a lot about in Albion's Eco-Eerie, and we'll get into that discussion. But Phil Smith, who is he? He is known for his work in mythnogeography, which is a play off of psychogeography. He has the book The Pattern in 2020. His most recent book before Albion's Eco-Eerie is Goblin Queens and Qualia Knights, which here it says repurposes the codes of chivalry and courtly love in an existential crisis. He's also one half of Crab and Bee with Helen Billinghurst, a visual artist, and resides in and has deals with a lot of walking projects. And so, Phil Smith, thank you for being here.
Hi, Marlowe. Hi, Stephen. I like the way you're channeling a sort of Fritz Lang lighting effect there.
I was going to say the same thing, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also very Southern Gothic. I think the lighting pattern created by the Venetian blinds recalls a lot of Tennessee Williams.
Yeah, there's a touch of the beguiled in there.
For those of you not watching this on YouTube, I am my hair is dazzled right now by sunlight. Um, so yeah, thanks again for coming on. And I think the first question, which is the question that I ask all of our interviewees, is how did you find out about Mark Fisher? What was your first introduction to him, and what has he meant for you?
Goodness, that's actually quite difficult to answer. I'm not sure. I'm trying to now think when I first heard of Mark Fisher and Mark Fisher's work. And I'm struggling actually, Stephen, to answer that. I've certainly known of the work for at least, I would say, 15 years, and I think probably originally, but I'm guessing now, but originally probably came across like quotations, references to it in other literature. That's my guess. And I think probably around the sort of the kind of hauntological the people talking perhaps online or in magazines or whatever around this kind of haunted generation, 70s TV, some of the folk horror stuff, and I think that probably read the name there and saw references to the weird and the eerie, and eventually thought I'm going to have to get this book and read it, and would have done that. So I probably first read the book, I don't know, maybe 10 to 12 years ago.
Where did the Eerie?
Yeah, is that possible? Was it published by then? I think no,
It was-
it's 2016 it's published, isn't it?
Yep.
So I must have read it fairly soon after it was published, I think.
Did you ever get a chance to meet him, or did you know people who were friends with him?
No, sadly not. No. I mean, I've listened and watched a number of his recorded lectures online, but no. But I certainly was well aware of him and had read a lot of his work by the time that he died.
Yeah. Weird and the Eerie is the book that this season is based on, and we're going through every chapter of it to give a breakdown of it. And the chapter that this is going to come out with is on Nigel Neal, and is called Eerie Thanatos, Nigel Neal and Alan Gardner. But first, I think, what drew you to The Weird and the Eerie, the book? Like you said, that was the first that you really gravitated towards that book. But what
Yeah,
about that book in particular? Most people, I think, go to capitalist realism or Ghosts of My Life, or they're K-punk fans. But I think Weird and the
yeah.
Eerie is that like secret one that people don't all know about.
Yeah, maybe I definitely did. I didn't come through being aware of Mark Fisher's work, his online work and his K-punk stuff. I wasn't aware of that. As I say, it was, I suppose, to wind the tape a little bit further back, at the sort of just around or just before the millennium, I sort of had this kind of shift in what I was doing, which was, so I was sort of working in small scale theatre as a writer of that, and just prior to the millennium, got into making site specific performance. So this much closer address to place rather than creating narratives or fictions for theatre spaces. And out of that came this kind of walking obsession. Again, continuing to with a very close attention to the kind of places, particularly sort of marginal spaces, edgelands, derelict spaces, post-industrial spaces, that kind of thing. And as well as actually being there, I sort of got interested again in where those landscapes turn up in fiction and in movies and TV. And I was already sort of into those spaces, in the sense of being deeply affected by them really from childhood.
Mm,
In the early episodes of Doctor Who, for example, yeah, that there's a very early serial, where I think it's the second of the Dalek serial, and it's basically, I think it's called Dalek's Invasion of Earth or something like that, and there's a it all takes place in this kind of derelict London. I mean, London's been, I mean, I'm sure well, I'm more than sure, I'm certain they were affected by the Blitz. They experienced, many of these writers were very influenced by childhood or teenage experiences of growing up under German bombing and seeing the possibility of the entire ruin of cities. And so that serial takes place. I mean, I was absolutely terrified, by this. I think it's the very first thing that happens is that the sort of the camera kind of pans in on a sign that says something like dumping of corpses in the river is banned, something like that. And then the next thing you see is this robo man who's kind of who's suffering some kind of breakdown. He's got this kind of prosthesis that the Daleks have put on his head and just kind of throws himself in the river. And I mean, the idea that you could have a prosthesis attached to you that would make you destroy yourself, to my sort of, I don't know what, 8 or 9 year old self, was absolutely terrifying. I mean, the sign was bad enough, but to see this happening, I was absolutely shocked. And then the Dalek then sort of perversely appears out of the water at the end of that episode. I mean, I didn't, the thought that Daleks could get underwater, I mean, it's bad enough the idea of Daleks at all.
yeah.
Um, but the idea that they would be underwater, that was completely shocking. So, but at the same time, when I would go into those types of environments, you know, into kind of ruined spaces, or I would travel in to London as a teenager on the train, and I'd see these continuing. There were sometimes there were bomb sites, sometimes they were just kind of kind of post-industrial sites. I felt a real I felt they had a real magic to them. That there was something about them where maybe things were more possible than perhaps in the usual kind of suburban shopping centre or residential district. There was something about those spaces that you felt you might meet a time traveling alien there. You know, that there was something about the possibility of them, the affordance of those spaces. So I think that's how I came and to want to read a book called Weird and Eerie, and was delighted once I got inside the book to find that so many of the references were to artifacts that I'd already encountered, and therefore meant a lot to me. Not all of it, I must admit. There are definitely sort of blank spaces for me in that book. I've never been able to get into the work of Alan Garner, who I know lots of people who like the stuff I like really like Alan Garner, and for some reason I've never been able to connect to his fictions and to the programs that are based on his work. But much of that stuff I was familiar with. Lovecraft I've been reading for, I don't know, 25 years or something. So there was a lot of resonance for me in it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. It lines up to a conversation me and Steve were having. I guess the only thing that can remotely approach something like the London bombing is in our lifetime is just the COVID lockdowns and all of that, where you just do see this sort of edge of society's mortality, and from that you do get this notion of, oh, there's other possibilities. So yeah, that whole idea of these spaces that still had the, scars of the bombings and all that growing up is.
We're getting into the eerie, and the one thing that I'm noticing about the whole section is it seems like so much of the work that we're reading and watching, including Quatermass, is dealing with the fallout of the London bombings. I'm reading The Birds at the moment when we're recording, and in that it's very much like a almost a recurring London bombing by the Birds, and she makes it very clear that they're having memories of the bombing, or they're using the same bunkers as they did when the bombing happened. And so there is this, and then you get into the Quatermass, and like we'll get into it in a little bit, but Quatermass in the Pit is also like the remnants or the traces of the London bombing. And
Yeah.
you can sort of see this as like almost an unconscious psyche that guides the eeriness that haunts the latter half of the 20th century London.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's part of the power of many of these artifacts, is that they reference a historical reality as well as a fantasy. So that there's something rooted in people's memories of real experiences. I mean, I grew up in Coventry, which although the bombing there is not comparable, say, to the suffering experience in the Japanese cities or in German cities like Dresden, it still was pretty intense for the people who were experiencing it. And there was one night in Coventry when I think just under 400 people died, and the center of the city, which was medieval, was burnt to the ground. I mean, it was a lot of it was wooden based. The cathedral went. So it was pretty extraordinary. My grandfather was on air raid warden duty that night. And he has this horrible story, which he didn't tell me, but apparently where my grandparents lived, which was above a shop, there was a pub opposite, and my granddad saw a tramp, a homeless guy, which was a rare thing, much rarer at that time than it is now, where it's ubiquitous. Saw this tramp outside the pub, wandering around the pub, and knew that the husband, there was a single woman living in the pub. The husband was fighting abroad. And my grandfather went over and told this guy to clear off and go up the road. And about 20 minutes later, up the road just went up with a whole string of bombs. And I know my grandfather feared that he'd unintentionally sent this man to his death. So one was aware of that. I used to play in a back garden, and I think were in it at that house, and my grandparents thought that 7 incendiary bombs had dropped one night onto the garden and onto the house, and they only ever found 6 of them. So there was always this sense that there was this lurking threat. I actually turned up, not a German bomb, but actually an anti-aircraft shell, unexploded, with a friend of mine. We dug it up on a building site and took it home and showed it to my friend.
Wow.
Well, he took it from my friend's father, who'd been a rear gunner on these Wellington bombers, and he kind of like nearly passed out on the spot and said, "You've got to take it back," which is interesting. Got us to take it back. I mean, it wasn't.
Rebury it.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't going to go off because we'd already tried to make it go off by throwing it at a electricity substation wall for 20 minutes. So that was probably a bit of it. Anyway, the bomb squad came and took it away. But so that reality was hanging around. But those spaces didn't just hold the feeling of threat. There was also, in those sort of liminal spaces, building sites, old derelict sites, there was a feeling that there was not just a ghost of the past, but also a ghost of the future, that time would get slippery in those spaces. And when I came to read The Weird and the Eerie, that a lot of the things that I just felt as a teenager and subsequently, a lot of those things came back to me, in a theoretical form.